Hi folks, welcome to review day 3. Today we're going to be reviewing the content that we covered for chapter 9. So remember, we only covered section 9.1 of chapter 9, and that was all on simplifying radicals. There were two main properties that we used to simplify, and one was called the product property and the other was called quotient. We're going to start with the product property. So remember that the product property is always when you have two things being multiplied within a square root, right? So the square root of a times b is the same thing as the square root of a times the square root of b. All right? Now, oftentimes we'll actually use this in order to simplify our radicals. Remember, what we did was if we had something like the square root of 24, we're always going to start by making a factor tree. So we're going to list out all of our factors. So we have 1 times 24, we have 2 times 12, we have 4 times 6, oh, I skipped one. We also have 3 times 8. I was thinking 8 times 3 in my head, which is why I skipped it. That's okay. All right, after you make a factor tree, then you pick your biggest perfect square. Remember, our perfect squares are 1, 4, 9, 16, so on and so forth. Here we can see that we have the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then we have 24, 12, 8, and 6. So, well, we know that both 1 and 4 are perfect squares, so we're going to pick the biggest one. So in order to simplify this down, we'd actually say that the square root of 24 is the same thing as the square root of 4 times the 6. Using the product property, we break that up into the square root of 4 times the square root of 6. And we know that the square root of 4 is plus and minus 2. So our final answer would be plus and minus 2 times the square root of 6, because the square root of 6 doesn't simplify. So that's how I use the product property. The quotient property is very similar. It says that when you have two things that are being divided under a square root, you can split them up. So the square root of a divided by b is the same thing as the square root of a divided by the square root of b. We can use that to simplify things like the square root of 9/24. 9/24 doesn't really simplify down super well, so what we can do is we can use the quotient property, right? Especially if you don't see that there's a 3 in each of the 9 and the 24, right? So that's one way of simplifying it down, but you can also use the quotient property, right? Since that's a little bit more straightforward. You don't need as much intuition. So the quotient property tells us that we'd have the square root of 9 over the square root of 24. And we know that the square root of 9 is just plus and minus 3, and the square root of 24 is, from our previous example, plus and minus 2 square roots of 6. All right? Now with this, there's something that we're going to have to do because we have a square root of 6 on the bottom. So if we have 3 over 2 square roots of 6, we have to rationalize the denominator. That means we're going to multiply the top by the square root of 6, and we're going to multiply the bottom by the square root of 6. All right, and we do that because then our square roots of 6 on the bottom cancel. So on the top, we have 3 square roots of 6, right, or 3 times the square root of 6. And on the bottom, we now have 2 times the square root of 6 squared, right, the square root of 6 squared. The squares and the square roots cancel, so we're just left with our 6, right? That was that shortcut that I showed you during the rationalize the denominator. All right, I'm going to go ahead and finish simplifying. So we have, I'll add in our plus and minus back in. So we have plus and minus 3 times the square root of 6 over 12. All right. One final step, though, and this is when I was telling you about, oh, well, technically we could simplify it first, right? We could simplify this 9/24 because they both have a factor of 3. The other way that we can do that is by saying, oh, look, 3 goes into 24. Or, sorry, 3 goes into 12. All right? So, if you divide the top by 3 and the bottom by 3, all right, we get plus and minus the square root of 6 over 4. All right, so we just divided the top by 3 and the bottom by 3. So that was our final simplification step. I know that that one was kind of a double whammy because we also had to rationalize the denominator, but I figured that that would be a good example to try out as our final review. All right, so there was one final aspect of chapter 9 that we covered, and that was simplifying radicals that had variables in them. So if we had something like the square root of x to the nth power, when n was even, when this exponent was an even number, then the answer, or this, like the simplified, fully simplified version, would be x to the n over 2. So for example, if we had the square root of x to the 6, all right, the answer would be x to the 6 over 2, or x cubed, or x to the 3. Now if we have an odd n, right, then we always have x to the n minus 1 over 2, and then we also have this square root, and inside that square root is our square root of x, all right? So if we had x to the 5th, for example, square root of x to the 5th, if we were to simplify that, we'd say, okay, that's the same thing as x to the 5 minus 1 over 2 times the square root of x. 5 minus 1 is 4, so we're left with x to the 4 halves, all right, times the square root of x. And 4 halves, or 4 divided by 2, is x squared, right? So we're left with x squared times the square root of x. So that was our final content piece for our variables, all right, for simplifying radicals that have variables in them. And that was your final required test in this course. Remember that we're going to be continuing on with Chapter 9 as an optional extra credit module. So if you have a lower test, like a lower average test score, and you want to try and raise that, the easiest way to do that is to do the Chapter 9 module and then do the test with it. All right, that's all I got for you today. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great rest of your trimester, and if I don't get to talk to you all again, have a great rest of your summer.